Good afternoon. So we are now at the concluding panel of this extraordinary conference, which hopefully will prove to be a decisive factor in determining whether mankind arrives at a new paradigm and not at Armageddon. I'm Diane Sayre. I am the founder and co-director of the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, and a long-term associate of Lyndon LaRouche, and currently a candidate for U.S. Senate in New York in 2022. So far, we have had extraordinary discussion starting yesterday morning with the panel chaired by Schiller Institute founder Helga Zepp-LaRouche on the global strategic situation, which includes the danger of thermonuclear war, which is also fueled by the incredible instability and danger in the United States of an ongoing attempted insurrection to throw the next election period into total chaos. That was followed by a discussion of Mr. LaRouche's fourth law, the fusion platform, with a really delightful discussion of a panel of scientists who I think are going to stay in touch and collaborate with our youth movement in advancing that cause. This morning, we had a very, again, wide-ranging panel on the question of the global strategic economic situation, the collapse, the COVID pandemic, certain conditions in the United States. And now we have the panel on culture, which also includes farmers, and I guess you can call it philosophers and farmers who are philosophers, and some very fine musicians like Bob Baker, who should use his lovely tenor voice more frequently. Helga made the point, I thought very powerfully, at the conclusion of the first panel, that the question of culture is actually the determining factor in all of this, because that is where you see what is your conception of man. Is your conception the oligarchical conception that man is just a beast, and what determines one's superiority is either physical power, money, a bloodline, genetics, or some other arbitrary factor? Or is man above the animal species by virtue of our likeness to the Creator, that is, our ability to be creative? And it's in that capacity that we will determine what the significance of this year 2020 is. I was really happy to hear Dr. Joycelyn Elders say that this could be the year, because of the pandemic, that human beings are awakened to the folly of the last 50 or 75 years of insanity. And I think that's what we should resolve. I would like to remind everyone that this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And when you look back and reflect upon the atrocities that were committed during the war by the Nazis, by others, you wonder how that could have happened even during the lifetime of some people who are still living today. It's not that long ago. And I fear that there are similar atrocities even being committed now, maybe perhaps not on that scale, but they're occurring. And the question is, why do we tolerate that? And as we ponder that, I would like to just take a moment now. Dennis Speed has referenced the dedication of this concert to, or this conference, to two individuals, but I would like to thank, first and foremost, Mr. LaRouche, who we also remember, because without him, I think many of us, perhaps many of you out there, were already historically significant individuals with a clear conception of your role in history. I certainly was not. And he gave all of us a great gift of locating that within his 2,500-year identity and of course his collaborators who just passed away this year, Phil Rubenstein and Ted Andromedis. So I think we should bear all of them in mind and bear in mind what Lynn always challenged us to think of, which is what will the world look like 50 years after we ourselves are gone. So with that being said, I would like to introduce my friend, the head of the party Solidarité et Progrès in France, former presidential candidate Jacques Cheminade.
I'm very happy to share with you your fight to rebuild human civilization against the criminal usury system. We are faced with a regression of our international standards towards inhuman savagery, wrote 2 years ago the essayist and philosopher, expert of human rights, Jean Ziegler. At the end of the 1970s, American thinker and political visionary Lyndon LaRouche characterized the counterculture which has generated such a regression as that of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The danger of war and of social chaos, something which is inflicted today to most of the peoples of the world, has not provoked a human mobilization in a Western society where reality is seen as a game played by virtual avatars. Bodily perceptions are played against the minds of the people in the advertisements and publicity screens plaguing the streets and subways of our cities, more than often associated with irrational violence. At a very young age, our kids are immersed in such a destructive and immature universe. The repetition of such actions and images creates addictive processes like those of drugs, leading the human imagination astray and preventing it from associating itself with reason and creativity. The official news lie or spread flows of horrendous faits divers about crimes, sexual abuses, or bloody scenes of war, while the social networks vomit impotent conspiracies associated with dark forces. With the spread of Google and digital money, our habits and way of life are captured and followed under the commercial and NSA, as bill been approved, political controls, creating a society of surveillance like never before in world history. The worst is that by inducing these habits of an easy life, it is willfully that we end up delivering all the data on us to the web and the banks. Our life is therefore managed out of reality and plunged into a hedonistic fear of physical death, while most of us are unable to react and mobilize against the very nature of the danger we fear. This is what I have to say first, because it is what we are living, what we are going through. It prevents us in Europe and the Western world from fighting for the absolute necessity of a meeting of the main world powers to create a new, peaceful order of stability through a common development of all our potentials. We have lost the sense in Europe and in the Western world of what Pope Paul VI had called in his encyclica Populorum Progressio the new name for peace, a mutual economic development. What I am going to tell you now is not inspired by some morbid observation, but by the conviction proved by human history that we can break such cultural rules of the game, imposed upon us precisely at the moment when they become, like it is the case today, unbearable. Provided that we make of that challenge the cause of our lives, committing ourselves to exemplify a culture of life and human discovery due to all of us. So what happened to us? Let's refer to what Lyndon LaRouche wrote on May 27, 2004, answering to the question, what does culture do? I now quote him. John Foster Dulles and James Jesus Angleton typify those who played a key role in bringing a key part of the Nazi SS intelligence apparatus into the inside of what became later the NATO system. It is such a NATO system which has been the cradle for the Club of Rome and its Malthusian conception that a world of necessarily limited resources has not the capacity to carry forward more human beings. As Aurelio Peccei, his head of the Club of Rome, stated or wrote, men are like the metastasis of a proliferating cancer whose growth has to be stopped. A proliferating cancer whose growth has to be stopped. With Alexander King, he was the individual that caused the spread of the statement that a world of necessarily limited resources cannot maintain an increasing population. Men, from that standpoint, are seen to be predators and polluters that destroy nature. As Prince Philip of Edinburgh once said, I dream to be born again as a killer virus for the good of humanity. An extreme but logical conclusion from this way of thinking, of non-thinking. The other does not represent a potential advantage, but an enemy threatening to plunder our crowd. Remember then that Prince Philip is himself a virus of the same type of those that John Foster Dulles and G.G. Angleton spread, being connected closely to family Nazi circles. For them, as members of a luring oligarchy, there are friends and enemies. And having defined their enemies as a form of evil, it becomes acceptable to promote their cancellation in what has become a cancel culture, rejecting the idea of human universality. The organizations that took over Western and Central Europe during the interval 1922-1945 were political assets of a network created and directed by a group of private financier houses taking the form of an international synarchy. This, after 1945 and following the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has taken the form of an Anglo-American dominated right-wing international, a right wing with a left hand, according to the circumstances. The Congress of Cultural Freedom was a product, after World War II, a cry of hatred, as LaRouche pointed out, a cry of hatred against the legacy of progress of the European civilization, a cry of hatred against the Renaissance of the 12th, 13th centuries and 15th, 16th centuries. To be clear at this point, this cry of hatred is also against all other civilizations, let it be the India of the Veda or the Confucianism in China. I stressed a left hand because internationally they label the criminal protection of their interests the responsibility to protect, as they did in Iraq, Libya, or Syria. Domestically, within all nations, they promote the same Dionysian culture of hedonism and despise of the Socratic dialogue and dialectics as the sophists did and later Nietzsche. To understand how it works, it is mandatory to examine how the historical divide to rule of the British Empire proceeds in its present mutant strain, as Algazep LaRouche as a concept, a mutating concept, but always with the same intention. On the one side, you play the white supremacist, and on the other, the cults of enraged minorities, none having a sense of what the common aims of mankind are. This is how the empire proceeds. It pits against each other through their organized corruption and bestialization, forces that potentially could be its enemies, and which through the manipulation of their misled emotions, fall into the trap of fighting against each other both committed to a world of segregation and hatred for the other, multiplied now by the algorithms of social networks set up by the Zuckerberg types, Facebook, and the violence of video games and TV series. Whatever the initial legitimacy of their fight was, they are trapped either into armed militias dreaming to lynch again, or into gangs yelling, "Burn, baby, burn," or "Kill the cops, not the pigs." It is the exact opposite of the advantage of the other from the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, or from the political lecture of Martin Luther King, "Why you should love your enemies." Obviously, not to endorse their ideas, but to provoke in them the human spark that could make them change. Remember that Tony Blair, the snaky servant of this Anglo-American network, declared in 1999 in Obama's Chicago that our purpose is to bring to an end the Westphalian order, which means the end of the sovereign nation state based on the service of humanity, the achievement upon which civilized modern European life has depended since then and the present time. This oligarchy, to accomplish its criminal views of what is now a universal fascism, promotes the fight against each other of states or so-called nationalisms committed to defend their roots and their petty interest against the others, without a positive project for the future of all. Divide to rule. They proceed with states as they proceed with ethnic, racial, or political associations, always against the principle of universality. In that sense, to be pessimistic about the United States of America is evil cultural rhetoric. But to pretend that the United States is great against all others is also evil rhetoric. Genuine, true optimism is to prove that the United States is great when it serves the cause of humanity, when it evokes the spirit of creativity of the American system of the Founding Fathers, or when it locates the spirit in Notre Dame or in the Duomo of Florence, as Trump did in one of his speeches, or when its logistics lead the fight against Nazism. I could say exactly the same for France. Charles de Gaulle, in his speech delivered to the University of Mexico on March 18, 1964, stated, "Beyond distances that shrink, ideologies that diminish, policies that wane, and unless humanity annihilates itself one day through monstrous destructions, the fact which will dominate the future is the unity of our universe. One cause, that of man, one necessity, that of world progress, and as a consequence, aid for all those countries that hope to get it for their development. A duty, that of peace, are, for our species, the very conditions for its life. A nation should not only unlock its own potentials, but those of the others." At this point, we should ask ourselves if the European civilization and culture has something specific to offer to the world. Lyndon LaRouche answers, "Although the nature of our species is the same everywhere, and although there is therefore a necessary long-term, long-ranging necessity for convergence of nations upon common principles of mutual conduct, the history of the development of European culture is based on the fundamental distinction between man and the beast, rooted in ancient Greece and in the Mosaic principles. It means politically the effort to establish a true nation-state republic, a true nation-state republic of citizens in conformity with such founding principles. The proof of that capacity is the exercise of creative powers given to all human individuals, as exemplified by Socrates inspiring a slave to double the surface of the square in Plato's Menon dialogue, or the construction of the Platonic solids followed by the achievements of Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation, Fermat, Huygens, Leibniz, Gauss, Riemann, and many others, a chain of continuous spring of discontinuous discoveries. This is a principle of the culture of the nation state, man's intervention on nature and the social process through which mankind increases our species power over nature. The figures of Prometheus and Jesus Christ are the key expressions of that culture. Prometheus is today slandered, in particular by rogue and blinded ecologists, as representing the cult of power per se, and not of the advantage of the other. The truth of the matter is that the oligarchy hates Prometheus as much as Zeus did. Aeschylus, in his Prometheus Bound, stated the historical truth. Prometheus embodies the intention to give the knowledge of universal physical principles to those human beings that Zeus intends to hold in the status of dehumanized human cattle. To be clear, it is a matter of universal physical principles to be re-experienced and relived, and not mere technological formulas restated by quasi-parrots. Jesus Christ is the expression of the Creator's love for mankind, as agape is the essence of practice of natural law in the practice of civilization. It embodies that love as a source of power to create, given to each of us, as expressed by Matthew 25:40, this concern for all. He says, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did to me." In terms of Western culture, Prometheus and Jesus Christ do not represent a break or a gap, but a continuity of concern for the development of humanity through the application of its creative powers. Lyndon LaRouche, with his first students and affiliates, and throughout his entire life, followed that principle, transmitting the acts of generating discoveries of universal physical principles which can be replicated, because it is the only way in which our species is able to advance. He always transmitted the right to know, never for the sake of knowing, but to intervene to improve society. He produced memos, articles, personal interventions to give the spark of inspiration, to steer the imagination beyond mathematical descriptions, because principles are not mathematical formula, but an integral, individual, indivisible also, object of the human mind, not that of a mere object. We're all here because of LaRouche's intervention as a key, unique representative of the specificity of European culture and civilization that more than anybody else he put into practice. But he meant true inspiration, often saying, "Do not imitate me, because that is a task of epigones, but be inspired by my method and efforts and enjoy the progress of your mind." Therefore, we Westerners have something unique, specific to bring to the world. It is nonetheless mandatory at this point to warn ourselves and the audience. First, I start to say at the beginning, we have betrayed our own culture. It started against other nations. In India, the British Empire looted, massacred, and destroyed with the help of the local oligarchy. In China, as Victor Hugo accused, the Imperial British and French bandits not only burned the Summer Palace, but imposed the consumption of opium in all Asia to tame the populations. Now, beginning mainly in the 20th century, starting with World War Wars I and II, we turned and did against our own people what we did to the others. The present horror of the counterculture, our present culture of death, because it is a culture of death, is the ultimate betrayal of the specificity of our European culture and civilization. Second, our European culture is not a product reserved to a geographical, geopolitical, or social domain. It is universal, and I would say, imitating what happened in a Clinton campaign, it is universal, stupid. So we can say that it is the achievement of modern forms of sovereignty by more nations, such as China and India, through their gaining the right to conduct their own affairs in a way informed by the achievements of the European form of modern sovereign nations, which has made possible advances in the whole human condition, not only for India and China, in the whole human condition. The paradox is that such an independence, anchored in the European principle of the nation state, had to be gained against the colonial degeneration of the European states themselves. Indian poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore stresses that the Indian society has to take advantage of the Western development of science to master the forces of nature with machines to serve man, but not accept the exploitation of man as a machine. We meet here the true concept of ecology, not the one distorted by the oligarchy to spread the idea of man and his machines as necessarily destructive. Third, our European culture teaches us to be explorers, not attached to our roots, but advancing always from our sources, inspired by what we don't yet know about other cultures, instead of trying to impose upon them our own prejudices. Let's listen to Tagore again, answering to Einstein during the meeting of July 14, 1930 in Berlin. The infinite personality of man comprehends the universe. There cannot be anything that cannot be subsumed to the human personality, and this proves that the truth of the universe is human truth. In his sadhana, meaning spiritual and disciplined commitment, he writes, "When we recognize the law in our moral nature, we reach a mastery of ourselves and we become free. By the same token, the more we understand the harmony of the physical universe, the more our life shares the joy of creation." Such is the ultimate meaning of our existence. We should always know that beauty is truth and truth beauty. This is a beautiful moment where the East meets the West. Tagore refers to Keats' ode on a Grecian urn. In his Religion of Man, Tagore goes even further. For that reason, the most human of all facts, as far as we are concerned, is that effectively we dream of the non-reached limitless, which gives a sense to what we have reached. Of all creatures, man alone, lives in a boundless future, as LaRouche often said. Our present is only part of it. The ideas yet to be born, the spirit yet shapeless, challenge our imagination with an insistence, which makes them even more real to our intelligence and other things around us. This is exactly how Einstein and LaRouche define the creative power of imagination, opening the gates for future creations. Later, Tagore states, "Through science, we proceed with a discipline that suppresses the personal limits and we thus reach that understanding of truth which is located in the spirit of the universal man." For Tagore, truth and beauty can only exist because of the existence of man. Although Einstein believes that truth is independent of human beings, it is understandable that he did so and that he thought so, because it was after his fights against Niels Bohr at the Solvay Conference of 1927, Bohr stating Bohr for which truth depended arbitrarily on human observation. It is not at all Tagore's view, who, like Einstein, is committed to find the causality in the universe through the power of imagination. Let's now listen to Einstein. "The discovery of special relativity has come to me through intuition and music," was the motto of force behind that intuition. "My discovery is a result of musical perception." Einstein and Tagore, as true geniuses, played and loved music as a power in the interval of the notes, when you expect something to logically follow, and suddenly a higher principle throws your mind above itself, closer to what Einstein called the nature of reality. Tagore, of course, was familiar with Western European culture more than most Europeans of his time, but he understood that the weakness of Western culture was to have arbitrarily separated the domain of physical phenomena and that of ideas. He found in Indian culture, in the Vedas, the capacity to understand the universe as a one, Truth, goodness, and beauty are indeed encompassed in the concept of Satyam, Shivam, Sunara. The delight to see and participate in such beauty is Ananda. It's called Ananda. And Tagore called Satyananda the joy of being one with the universal one. In that sense, we meet Schiller's letters on the aesthetical education of man, the education of our emotions associated to our creative powers. The dialogue of cultures is therefore needed to enrich each other with the best that each can bring. A scholar of Chinese culture put it in an interesting way. It is a power to debug our own culture through a confrontation leading to the overcoming of mutual constraints. Not to reach a uniformization, but to reach the compatibility or the co-possibility, as Leibniz would say, of both. Not to exceed a gap, but to overcome the contradiction at a higher level of thinking, what Nicolaus von Kues, the Cusanus, called the coincidence of the opposites, that Elgar referred many times about it, a culture beyond the given cultural borders. Now let's lend our ear to the Chinese culture. The key concept is a ren, the sense of goodness, knowledge, and love for humanity. Confucius, in his Analects, defines it. To practice the ren means to start by oneself, to want to establish the others as much as we want to establish ourselves, and to wish their accomplishment as much as we wish our own. Find in yourself the idea of all you can do for the others. That is what will orient you in the way to the ren. This is why the Tao, in that sense, is more to know how to walk than to reach a perfection that is unreachable but necessary as the orientation. Mencius, the spiritual heir of Confucius, adds, answering to a disciple, the sensory organs don't have the capacity to think and let themselves be obsessed by external things. The organ which is the heart of spirit has only the faculty of thinking. If he thinks, he's the only one to have the faculty of thinking. If he thinks, he would understand things, but if he does not think, he would not be able to understand them. This is what heaven has endowed us with. Provided that we start to build up what is great in us, smallness would never succeed. No more is needed to become a great man. To practice the ren hence demands to break with the logic of our mental habits, which obstruct the Tao, and to meet the other not as an assimilation, but as a sort of an opportunity for a second life. The difference between me and the other is not abolished, but a new view emerges in our way as a landscape emerges out of the fog of the best Chinese paintings. As in the Western Christianity, the ideal is a saint, committed to do the good to prevent the evil to appear. In the Chinese culture, the ideal is a wise man, always available for the others to facilitate an improvement of the way towards the ren for the whole society. It is obviously not the same, but the two are not only compatible, but do create a coincidence in a higher universe. The great German philosopher Leibniz, again, in his Novissima Sinica, stated that missions of Westerners should go to China to teach the most advantaged sciences, creativity in the domain of nature, while missions of Easterners should be sent to the West to teach social harmony, creativity in the domain of human relations. The opportunity wasn't missed, but I am deeply convinced that it is now, again, given to us, if we step above the present destructive confrontations, which are against both the spirit of the West and of the East, represented, among others, and notably by India and China. This does not mean that the governments of our countries are perfect, but if they were, we would not be needed. And we are very badly needed because a military mistake in the context of the geopolitical and financial state of things may lead to the extinction of humanity, as was said by many speakers before. My most deep certitude is that Ananda, Zen, and Agape, although they are not the same, are all led by the same human impulse where beauty, goodness, and truth meet. It is up to each of us to prove in a dialogue of cultures and civilization which traces a path to the achievement of the common aims of humanity. I said not the same, unfortunately so, because we exist in diverse forms of congruence towards a unity. We have all to become explorers, because to accomplish our task, we need the courage to consider our own way of thinking, to identify our prejudices, which prevent us to articulate an hypothesis to reach a common better future, an age of reason inspired by the education of our emotions. I am optimistic, despite of what I said before, because human creativity has made of us, as proved by Russian biochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, has made of us more and more responsible for all life. The fact that we are here all together, even if all our ideas and conceptions are not the same, confirms my optimism, our optimism, provided we fight to keep it. It is that reasonable, informed, and emotional optimism that we have to convey to the main leaders of our world. What we have achieved in these 2 days should be the example given to them as a social process. If we become explorers and creators, the coincidence of the opposites become not only a possibility, but the happiest way to solve all petty issues. Let me end with a quote from Tagore. India being apparently not at her best these days, my intention is to give her a gift of the best that she gave to us. Tagore, we meet many faces in our world, but only some of them penetrate in our spirit, almost without our knowledge. It is not because of their beauty that they impose their presence upon us, but because of another quality. In most of the faces, the human nature does not show itself. But there are a few where this mysterious inequality manifests itself spontaneously. Then such a face stands out among thousands of others and suddenly imposes itself on our mind. I am more optimistic than Tagore. I do know, that each and all of us can gain such a face, including our so still imperfect world leaders, if we meet the challenge facing us to get out of the ruling, disgusting, criminal, and inhuman savagery. Now, let's be guided along the creative path by our chorus of farmers and thinkers. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So moving to the farmers and musicians, we have Marcia Mary Baker, who is on the editorial board of Executive Intelligence Review. Her presentation is entitled "The Hunger Pandemic Predates COVID-19. Superpower Action Can Save Lives, Save the Future."
Last year, 2019, before the novel coronavirus had even shown up, it was the 5th straight year that hunger had increased in the world. 1 out of every 8 people you could call food insecure. That is, they didn't have enough reliable food, or if they had food, it was insufficient. Now, the numbers are like 812 million people out of 7.4 billion. And understand, this is a net figure because China, for the same time period, had been lifting people up out of poverty and hunger. So think about the formal definition of famine. It usually means that 20% of your population in the nation or area do not have enough food to sustain them in life. So, and you usually think, when you say famine, of crop failure or crop disease or a flood or a typhoon. But now, besides war and strife, we have refugees. And there's poverty so bad with the pandemic, people can't even afford to eat. So by this 20% definition, we have many nations in famine on different continents: Afghanistan, Yemen, the Republic of Congo, Haiti, and more. In July, the World Food Program put out this map. It shows where we are after 6 months into the spread of COVID-19. There are some 30 nations you can call hotspots for hunger. Now, this food program is the agency that delivers emergency food, and also they deliver the COVID-19 pandemic supplies. the masks, the PPE, disaster relief, chemicals. Look at this continent by continent and begin with Africa, because on that continent, you see 15 nations on the map. The combined number of people in those nations, not their whole populations, but the ones actually needing food, is 154 million. Go to Asia. You see 6 nations shown, from Yemen all the way eastward. Now, the number of people in these nations needing food assistance within them totals to 59 million people. And then come to the Americas. There are 9 nations shown now. Last year, it was 6 before the pandemic. And the number of people in need now is 16 million people. Last year, it was over something like 4.5 million. So this is how bad it is. Now, we have been forewarned. Let's go back a generation. 30 years ago, in the fall, after a terrible North American drought in 1988, Lyndon LaRouche, with his wife Helga, commissioned a special wing of the Schiller Institute. And it was founded then called Food for Peace, harking back to the previous generation after World War II. And it was an effort to shift the economic policy to prevent mass hunger like we see today, and to defend the independent family farm system. And people came together in Chicago in September, and then in December, Lyndon LaRouche addressed farmers, diplomats, people from around the world. And here's what he said. He said, it's almost as if we can hear a section of the Lord's Prayer coming up from the developing nations, from the poor in Eastern Europe, and from the poor in the United States, our own country. Give us this day our daily bread. The question is, who is going to answer that prayer? Who is going to be the hand of providence? That's what Lyndon LaRouche said in Chicago to the farmers and to the people there from around the world. Now, he spelled out in the ensuing years, he had already spelled it out, what kind of development programs you need with agriculture and industry. In passing, let me say, within 3 weeks of his speech in Chicago to give us this day our daily bread, he was jailed wrongfully. Now, here we are today. The World Food Program is now working against mass hunger as never before in its existence. It was founded in 1961, seen from a staging center in Asia. There are different pre-staging centers on every continent. Now, what happened is in April, the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, went to the UN Security Council on this worsening picture, and he briefed them. And here's his language. He said, we are on the verge of a hunger pandemic. If we don't prepare and act now, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions within a few short months. He said that even before COVID-19, I said that 2020 would be the worst humanitarian disaster since World War II. Then he gave the numbers to the Security Council I already showed, and he said, our analysis shows that 300,000 people could starve to death every single day over a 3-month period, given this magnitude. And he said this does not include the increase of starvation due to COVID-19. Okay, so what happened? That was April. I showed you the map in July. At present, 10,000 children a month are dying for lack of food. Each month, 500,000 children sink into a condition that we've called for years wasting. They're not only not growing, they're diminishing and wasting away. Now, what are the amounts of resources needed? Well, the World Food Program is asking for merely $4.9 billion by the end of the year for the food drive itself, and another billion, 965 million exactly, to cover the logistics of shipping out all of the anti-pandemic supplies. But here's where we stand. As of the end of August, towards 5 billion, you only had 750 million. Towards 965 million, you had only 200 million. So we're way short. Now, leave the money aside. Think what we really can do. The two world food superpowers are the United States and China. The U.S. is the #1 producer of corn in the world. The United States alone produces 35% of the world's corn harvest. China is the #2 corn producer. China is the #1 producer of rice. Well, of course, people eat it, they live there, but that's not the issue here. If China and the US would just initiate joint consultations and work with other nations, the hunger pandemic would be over by the end of this year. It doesn't mean they would supply all the food themselves. It means that over time, month by month, and then between the northern and southern hemisphere of food seasons and crop seasons, you could figure it out, stage the food, commission it, and deliver it. We could feed everyone. And at the same time, we would have the momentum to start changing the whole system so we never have this hunger pandemic emergency again, ever. Now, lastly, look at agriculture technology in this perspective. There are a couple satellite photos of corn in Iowa, the leading corn state in the US and the world. The first scene in July shows lush green fields, except for the cities. The capital there is Des Moines. But then the second photo from space shows the light areas where the cornfields were ruined by a big horizontal storm. They call it a derecho that came through and went across the whole state, August 11th, 10th. Now, the point is not the bad weather. The point is we're in the space age. If we can take these photographs from space, it shows you we can end the famine on Earth. What we have is a policy disaster, not a natural disaster. And that's the point of having a great powers summit. Ending hunger is urgent for the agenda of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council. Countries are invited by President Putin to meet soon. And that would be, of course, the United States and Russia and China and France and Britain. And there's one more point about the hunger pandemic. It's a big lie. There's a big lie. There's enough food in the world, but it's distributed unfairly. Now, the unfairness part is true, but the rest is bunk. We really need to double world food production. Use grain as the metric and follow the math. The total volume of grain or equivalent you need per year for direct eating as basic staples, whether it's noodles or dumplings or tortillas or bread, that you can figure out. Then you add more grain per person and then for your population for indirect eating. And that would be for milk, eggs, goat meat, whatever you eat, beef, and then add some food reserves and wastage. And that totals up to 5 billion tons of grain a year that the earth could and should produce for 7.5 billion people, and just keep adding on as we go in the future. But we're producing less than 3 billion tons. We're actually more like 2.5 billion. Now, when I say that, that gives the farmers listening a heart attack, because the big lie is also that if you produce plenty of food, the farmers get stuck. They get ruined because they get less price, supply and demand. But that's another fraud. We have to change these frauds. Nations have the sovereign economic power to determine floor prices or parity prices to their farmers, and to determine that everyone, all their people eat. That's physical economy. We have to dump the London kind of British neo-East India plantation system associated with famine. Get rid of it. Spread the joy of producing. Save lives. Save the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Marcia. Next, we're going to hear from Bob Baker, who is the Schiller Institute Farm Liaison, and he will introduce the other farm leaders on this part of the panel.
Thank you very much. There are no physical limits to providing plenty of good food for every one of the 7.5 billion people on Earth and the billions to come. We have a policy crisis. This is a scene I took earlier this week. This summer has been very dry, and many corn producers, the crops are hurt. The corn is poor, but they will make the best of it by chopping silage, as we see here. Over half a century ago, right after World War II, there was a strong impulse to use science and good policy everywhere, to go out and rebuild from the war-torn rubble, and also to uplift everybody from the pre-war colonial oppression, especially British colonies in Asia and Africa. The whole world should grow in manufacturing, agriculture, infrastructure, and especially nuclear power. This meant not only energy, but nuclear science. New institutions were crafted. The financial system was designed in 1944 in New Hampshire, in Bretton Woods, and world figures came together. There was to be a stable currency exchange and credit for production. There was to be no globalist trade organizations, monopolies, over and above national sovereignty, just a loose association of general agreements on tariffs and trade. All this is in the tradition of what in the 1800s was called the American system of economics. The new international network for science research in crops and livestock began in Mexico, called the International Corn and Wheat Improvement Center. Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, set that up. Mexico became a grain surplus exporter. And because of that research, India became food self-sufficient in 1974, and China became food self-sufficient in 1984. Centers like this were set up all around the world. We had rice research centers set up in the Philippines, potatoes in Peru, and livestock in Kenya, and countries, over 20 different areas of the world. This was a real green revolution. But within a generation, this momentum for mankind was stopped. Currencies swung up and down. Food and farming were financialized. The Bretton Woods system was put out of business. You got credit only if you obeyed the terms of Wall Street and the City of London, the centers of monopolistic colonialism. Farmers and manufacturers tried to hold out, and they tried to ride the wave of generations before them, but they were undercut. The public was told, you'll get cheap food if Walmart takes over your county. Farmers were told, you have to compete, so get big or get out. Government was told, your food has to be outsourced, not just grown in your own country. Bring it in cheap. You're not allowed to support your farmers anymore. Commodity control cartels grew like the world has never seen. All types of food was forced under terrible control by a web of cartels. And after the 1970s, cartels even changed the laws so they got patent rights for developing new life forms, new genetic material, and with few exceptions, except like in China. Now look at the U.S. 80% of all the cattle are slaughtered and combined with meat from around the world and other countries by 4 transnational mega corporations. One of the 4 is JBS, a Brazilian-owned company. It's the world's biggest meat company, operating from Germany to Australia on 5 continents. It has 230,000 employees, a gigantic packing houses, huge. And slave labor in Germany from like Romania and Bulgaria. In the US, it comes from Africa and Central America, and in Brazil, from the poorest people with no other livelihood. The producers are systematically underpaid for their cattle, sheep, and chickens. This has become the norm. This is what we're up against. I can show you the same thing with all the other cartel companies. When the COVID-19 virus hit, no wonder these plants shut down and food chaos hit. Farmers and ranchers were then stuck with millions of cattle and pigs with nowhere to process them. They can't withstand bad weather, a virus, or anything. This cartel system is for making money and not food. But there's momentum to this to change it. In the United States, for example, there are pushbacks which President Trump has responded to. In May, Trump ordered the Department of Justice to investigate the cartel price rigging. In July, the Senate has a two-party bill to mandate half of the purchases of the cattle by the cartels, and they must, be open cash markets, not rigged contracted prices behind the scenes. There's a petition to restore country of origin labeling, where imported meat must be labeled so people know where it's from. And Congress got rid of that in 2015. The petition now has over 500,000 signatures to reinstate. But we must change the system. And President Trump is not going to go the whole way against this cartel system with Wall Street still in his cabinet. I myself recommend we commit to a producers' initiative, which with Wall Street, wherever we live, everywhere in the world, whatever we produce, to insist that we change the system. We have examples all across the U.S. of producers trying to get food to charities feeding people who need it. Make this international. Cross all the borders. Country and city people, nation to nation, jump the fence, cross all the boundaries, and we can restore morality to food. Ron Wyzorek will speak from South Dakota. He's a cattleman. In 2018, he was on the state ballot for the U.S. Congress as an independent. He's a longtime promoter, prominent fighter in the Farm Belt for LaRouche's approach to the American system of economics. Nicole Frank, will speak from Kansas. She's a cattle rancher. She's the secretary-treasurer of the Kansas Cattlemen's Association, a recent Kansas State University graduate, and Nicole is a leader in cattle country while still in her 20s. And Mike Calicrate will speak from Colorado. Mike is a cattleman, a meat processing entrepreneur, and policy fighter for decades. He's spoken out all over. He's an advocate for a new paradigm in food. I want to thank you. And now let's listen to the following speakers.
Hi, my name is Nicole Frank. I'm a fifth generation cattleman. I live in Kansas, and being a cattleman, we go through a lot of people with labeling. A lot of people, especially with the World Wildlife Federation or animal rights people, and pretty much our own government, they're saying we're the bad people. They're saying we don't know what we're doing, and they said they need to take over. Well, 2 years ago, we had the worst winter I could ever think of. It was snow every other day, ice every other day, and we still had to get up and check our cows because it were calving season. We have a fall and spring herd. And I would wake up at 5:30, check on the heifers. Mom would go out and check on the cows. And it was getting so bad that we would ask how many are dead. We don't do it because we're heartless. We have a heart. Yes, it's our income, but we take pride in taking care of these four-legged critters. That same year, the year before, we lost 452 farmers and ranchers due to suicide. You won't hear that. We are a proud people. You have to feel it in your soul that you're going to be a farmer, that you want to take care of somebody. You want to help feed the world. We lost 452. That number jumped up to 515. That's not all of it. A lot of the numbers weren't counted because everyone puts down as farm accident. You hear a farm accident, that's actually a farm suicide. And then the packers, they don't care. They drop the prices. This last spring, we were selling our last load of fall calves, and it was $1.18. Oh, that's a good price. And then one of the Tyson's plant in Kansas, it was a storage unit full of boxes, not even on the site, caught on fire. And they had to shut everything down. Do you think the packers would have all said, okay, we're going to compete now? No. They all went into a black room and said, we're going to drop the prices. Instead of getting $1.18, we got 99 cents. And then COVID hit. That has nothing to do with the beef industry. And you know what happened there? I saw the prices went down to 84 cents. And last time it was 84 cents was back when my grandpa was young. These packers don't care about us. They started what is called the beef checkoff to supposedly help promote beef so consumers would be able to eat it. Well, they're using that money to buy seating at the World Wildlife Federation to be part of the extinction of us ranchers. The consumers don't even know where the food comes from. The packers are like, we're going to import. We import from 20 different countries. And all 20 different countries, they have different regulations, and they can use products that are illegal in the United States. We're constantly getting bad rep because we're getting ground meat from Brazil, coming over and is contaminating our meat. And consumers are told to blame us. Consumers want American product. And the only way to sell the cheap foreign product is the stamping product of USA. And that shoots the price down, and that even shoots the price down for the foreign countries. Us Americans, we raise the most safest meat in the whole world. And they don't care about us. We know how to take care of. They say it's sustainability. We've been sustainable for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and we keep getting sustainable. We know how to take care of our livestock, but we're the ones that are dying. My livelihood is dying because we're going bankrupt because we can't afford all the damage that Mother Nature throws at us and all the damage that the media puts on us. And the poor consumers are getting the blunt end of it because they're thinking they're buying healthy when they're actually not. Just please. I want to do what's right for the consumer. The consumer has the right to know where their meat comes from. The consumer has the right to know that it's healthy. The consumer doesn't need to live in fear and be forced to eat their dog food. That's what they're going for now. They're saying, oh, the Whopper burger, it's pretty much you look at the ingredients that's in that, the ingredients of the dog food, all they have to do is just put water with the dog food and mash it up and find seasonings to make it smell like meat. Do you want to eat dog food? Just keep turning a blind eye. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Callicrate. I live in St. Francis, Kansas, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Our livestock operation is in Kansas, and we ship our beef into Colorado Springs to sell it into the urban centers along the Front Range of Colorado. Bob Baker asked me to present a short piece today about some of the things we're doing here in our region to make life better for ranchers and farmers and giving consumers better access to real food from the local and regional areas that they live in. And so, we talk about building new pathways to prosperity through farming and food. COVID-19 has exposed a failed system, abused, unhealthy, inhumane, and incapable of feeding people. It's been a real opportunity, I think, to pull the curtain back and show people everywhere just how fragile the industrial food system is, and how, in fact, it doesn't serve anyone except for a handful of the people who control it at the very top of the economy. And so how do we build a food system that is more secure, that reduces and decentralizes the abusive market power? How do we ensure farmers, ranchers, and workers earn living incomes, rebuild rural communities? How do we produce healthier and safer food? And how do we become more resilient to be able to stand the kind of risks that things like COVID-19 presents to us in this rapidly changing world? So the malnourishment or the impoverishment and malnourishment of a civilization is directly correlated with the consolidation and industrialization of the food supply. And what we have now today is the most industrialized and the most concentrated food system ever in the history of mankind. And it is like a mining operation. It is extracting wealth at unprecedented rates, but leaving a very polluted world behind and a lot of poverty. And so the wealth is being concentrated at the top, and poverty and hunger at the bottom. In Washington, D.C., on the United States Department of Agriculture offices and main building, there's an inscription, and it's a quote from St. Paul. So it says, "The husbandman that laboreth must be the first partaker of the fruits." In other words, the people who do the work, that take the risk and invest the capital, really deserve a fair share of the wealth that they create. That is not happening today. So just the opposite, in fact, is happening. The husbandman is getting the leftovers, or the husbandman, the farmer, the rancher, the people on the land, the worker, are essentially getting the crumbs, the leftovers, and in fact are doing it for less than the cost of production in almost every case. So how do we improve the lives of people and restore health back to the land? Well, first of all, let's look at a different model of farming. Let's look at a regenerative model of farming that builds soil, that takes into consideration the health of the community as well as the health of the people that are involved in the production of our food, but also the health of the consumer that eats the food. So this is what we do in St. Francis, Kansas with Cattle Company. It's basically all about the soil. We take from the soil and we put back to the soil. What's our pathway to the Francis, Kansas to Colorado Springs and the Denver Front Range area, but what is it in other countries and other places? And I love the idea of the publicly owned food utilities concept, where the public actually owns much of the infrastructure from the farm and ranch gate to the consumer's plate, enabling people that are on the land to get access to consumers and going around the concentrated industries that we currently are dealing with, the big meat packers, the big retailers, the big food service companies that are extracting the wealth and leaving us with nothing. How do we build the safe and profitable pathways to the consumer? And so what we've done is we've decided to not sell our cattle to big meat packers anymore. And for the last 9 years, this mobile slaughter unit has been in St. Francis, Kansas at our cattle operation. It's got a complete corral system, as you can see here. It's got a kill box where the animal's killed humanely under USDA inspection. And this trailer produces a carcass. And this carcass then is hauled up to Colorado Springs to our food hub. And this could be a food hub in Lusaka, Zambia. It could be a food hub in Philadelphia. It could be a food hub just anywhere in the world. But it's where food can be brought in its raw form and transformed into food that can be purchased by consumers. And of course, this needs to also include the marketplace, to where the consumer can not only see how their food is being handled and produced and processed, but have access to be able to purchase it. And so this is what we have in Colorado Springs to meet that objective. This company, Ranch Foods Direct, has been around about 20 years, and the Peak to Plains Food Distribution Hub is a 3-year-old project here in Colorado Springs. This is an example of a unit that is in Namibia, Africa. It's going very well over there. It is built to the specs so it can be inspected, depending on the rules of the place where the unit is. But this is a far better alternative for a community than the big meat packing conglomerates that you know, that are capturing all of the profit and leaving us with nothing. And so with this model, you basically kill the animal where they are, which is far more humane, and it produces a cleaner product going to the consumer. The carcasses are aged properly and then cut up somewhere in the urban center or near where the consumers are. Friesla is the name of the company that provides these facilities, and I just think it's a brilliant way to rebuild infrastructure and do it in either a mobile or, in this case, in this slide, a modular type of an approach. And so if you don't plan on moving the unit, which I would recommend you not do, because by using it in a sort of docking station type of a format, we can really control everything. We can control the water, the electricity, we can control the slaughter waste, and we can also control the animals in a good corral system where they can be humanely euthanized. And so this is our idea of what we're working on in Colorado and Kansas, and really all across the country. We're starting to see much more interest in this, but we've got to have the support of the consumer. Without the support of the consumer being willing to buy their food from these sources, it can't survive. And this food doesn't need to be more expensive. We've cut out a lot of the unfair profits that the big meat packers and retailers and food service companies have been taking, and just basically just send it back to where it belongs. It belongs at the farm and ranch gate. Workers deserve to be paid a fair price for their labor. We take good care of the environment. This is a beautiful, sustainable, and regenerative way to go. So, thank you.
I just wanted to make a few points here on, you know, the number of people we've got involved in agriculture anymore. In the starting of the country, basically there was 90% of the people were involved in agriculture. By 1850, we had 1.4 million people in agriculture. By 1914, we had 6.4 million people in agriculture. 1950, you know, during the 30s, and we started losing farms then. In the 50s, we lost some farms. But by 1950, we had 5.6 million. And today we're down to just a little over 2 million farmers again. I mean, the percentage and the population of the country has, you know, increased dramatically. So we've got, percentage-wise, we've got way less farmers representing the agriculture sector than we've ever had in the history of the country. So we need to address to the consumers that they have to become involved in this agriculture sector because of what's happening, you know, with the collapsing economy and the infrastructure is falling apart. For example, right now in California, you've got I believe it's like 1.4 million acres of forest and productive land that have basically burned up. 7,000 fires going on. That's more than they had last year or the year before. We're looking at the Greco that went across Iowa and wiped out and damaged an estimated 14 million acres of crops. The storage facilities were destroyed. The infrastructure is down. The agriculture sector is being destroyed. Right now in west South Dakota this afternoon, we had hailstorms going through with 1.5 inches hail destroying crops all across North Dakota. It's supposed to move into Minnesota, across Wisconsin, and across the lake states there and into the Northeast. So, I mean, the agriculture sector is being destroyed. So if we don't become very alarmed very soon, I mean, a lot of this could have prevented if people had listened to Lyndon LaRouche. We had applied his 4 laws. We had Glass-Steagall back on the books. We had the Bretton Woods system back on the books to curb the speculation that's going on and destroying the productive sector that's left. I feel sorry for these young people, and I really feel sorry for the eaters if they don't come to their senses soon and demand support for the productive sector and an economic system that will support infrastructure building and this infrastructure. It's just like Nawapa. If we had that Nawapa for California, would we have all these houses burned down, all these potential forests for future homes that we should have? That's not available to these kids anymore. It's time to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob, Ron, and the others. We now are going to hear from Paul Gallagher, also on the editorial board of Executive Intelligence Review, and his topic is the British system versus the American system, why the collapse is inevitable.
Between 1971 and 1973, banks of the City of London and its offshore centers destroyed President Franklin Roosevelt's post-war Bretton Woods monetary and credit system. London's offshore banks broke all the Bretton Woods rules with the blessing of the Bank of England and organized a giant dollar carry trade known as the Eurodollar and Petrodollar markets. These markets resumed the standard British banking model, lending directly at very high interest rates to sovereign governments, in this case, developing nations. By 1980, these British banks had Wall Street in tow, and through these markets had hosted 2 gigantic oil hoaxes, generated rampant inflation throughout the industrial nations, set off a third world debt bomb, and the world economy was awash in speculation in currency values, interest rates, etc. In another 5 years after that, the vast majority of new dollar currency was actually being created in London for speculative purposes. It is this offshore London floating exchange rate system, which after 35 years of deindustrialization and financialization of all economic activity, reached its collapse in the huge implosion of derivatives and derivatives markets, which set off the global financial crisis of 2008 and the so-called Great Recession. Since then, more than a decade of absolutely heroic Keynesian money printing by the major central banks of the United States, Europe, and Japan has failed to generate industrial recovery, any productivity, or even inflation, and has put $7 of debt and derivatives on top of every dollar of largely non-productive GDP. This floating exchange rate system is set for one more financial blowout now, triggered by the unpayable corporate debt bubble and its derivatives, and which will have no recovery. At that Bretton Woods conference after World War II, a British plan had been presented by, among others, the celebrated economist John Maynard Keynes, which reflected the idea that the source of wealth in the post-war world, as before, would be trade and trade preferences. The International Monetary Fund was to have the function of balancing world trade. Countries with trade surpluses would be steered into spending them on imports from deficit countries, thus eliminating the surpluses. If they did not do so within a certain short deadline, the IMF's proposed clearing agreements, as they were called, would confiscate the surplus. Effectively, surplus nations were not to accumulate those surpluses, nor use them as capital for domestic development. A world currency, or what was called an inconvertible unit of account, would be created to manage these so-called clearing agreements. Now, Keynes's theories aside, the British delegation demanded that Britain's imperial trade preferences be maintained within a sterling block inside Bretton Woods, and they were. Nonetheless, shaped by FDR, the Bretton Woods system clearly reflected the American system of economy. It aimed to stop international speculation, that is, capital moving across borders for speculative purposes. Currency exchange rates were stabilized, nearly fixed, not on a gold standard, but linked to the dollar and based on gold reserves. Exchange controls were encouraged. Capital controls were permitted to any nation. Interest rates on deposits were limited by national laws to stop boom and bust carry trades. Commercial banks were separated by law from speculative investment banks in the major industrial nations. And FDR's purpose for the World Bank, which unfortunately was not realized, was to issue credit for the most important development projects in the underdeveloped nations. This American system of economics was developed by Alexander Hamilton. As first Treasury Secretary, Hamilton confronted two basic ideas of what generates wealth and value in an economy. The French physiocrats said the source of economic wealth or profit was land. It alone could return or generate more value than was put into it by human labor and capital, which merely reproduced their value from one cycle to the next. The English economic schools taught that the source of value, as said before, was trade, being able to buy cheap and sell dear, and therefore producing what a country could export at the greatest return and importing cheaply whatever it could. This is taught now as the idea of comparative advantage. Adam Smith wrote over and over again in various ways in his Wealth of Nations. Here's one quote: "Were the Americans to stop the importation of European manufactures, and by thus giving a monopoly to such of their own countrymen as could manufacture the like goods, divert any considerable part of their capital into this employment, they would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce, and would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country toward real wealth and greatness. So don't try to develop a full set economy, you will lose." The British-India colonial relation epitomized this British free trade doctrine of economic wealth. Colonial India, for more than a century after 1820, ran a large trade surplus with the world, 40% of it from forced opium sales to China. And India was compelled to use all that surplus and more to buy manufactured goods and gold and silver from Britain, with which it ran a large trade deficit throughout that period. This was the system of imperial preferences, which was the subject of heated arguments between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill over post-World War II economic policy. India's capital was not invested in India, but flowed steadily as it was accumulated to Britain through so-called trade and through remittances by British colonial officers. Indian agriculture, which, though it was producing most of those exports, which produced that trade surplus with the rest of the world, lost the capacity to produce food reliably at all, and tens of millions of Indians died in unprecedented famines during that period of time. When Treasury Secretary Hamilton wrote the reports presenting the American School of Economics, he had determined that the source of economic value is the human creative invention, applied to increasing the skills of labor and creating artificial labor in the form of machinery. His 1790 report on manufactures to the US Congress began with a direct statement and refutation, first of the physiocratic doctrine, and then of Smith's Wealth of Nations. he had to fight his contemporaries to spread the idea that manufacturing not only created as much new value as land, but more, and increasingly more, with more diversity of manufacturing and more division of labor, and still more with more creative human invention. In that report is found Hamilton's most famous statement on human creation, human creative invention and economics. Quote, "To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted," unquote. And he also wrote there, quote, "Experience teaches that men are often so much governed by what they are accustomed to see and practice that improvements are adopted with hesitation and reluctance. To produce the desirable changes as early as may be expedient may therefore require the incitement and patronage of government. It is of importance that the confidence of cautious, sagacious capitalists should be excited. And to inspire this description of persons with confidence, it is essential that they should be made to see in any project which is new and precarious the prospect of such a degree of support from government as may be capable of overcoming the obstacles inseparable from first experiments," unquote. One of Hamilton's significant principles was the nature of banks. They would gather the savings of the nation as deposits and put them at the disposal of those able to use them most productively at a given time by lending primarily to productive businesses, secondarily to individuals and households. They would not speculate in securities, brokerage, or real estate as various kinds of investment partnerships do. This is what we know as the commercial bank. But in the British floating exchange rate system over the last 50 years, it was gradually displaced by the gigantic universal banks of Wall Street and London today, and Glass-Steagall, the principle, was abandoned. The national bank Hamilton created, the Bank of the United States, was simply a larger commercial bank which explicitly pursued national public purposes, including ensuring sufficient circulation of properly funded national debt in the form of gold reserve currency, and issuing credit for national projects of new economic infrastructure. The Bank of England was in no way Hamilton's national banking model. It was formed as an investment partnership of wealthy brokers in 1694 to lend more than £1 million to the British government at the very high rate of 8%. And on April 8th of this year, some 325 years later, the Bank of England was still announcing its intention to lend money directly to the English government as needed. Hamilton's principles required that the government sell adequately funded debt to its people and private institutions, not to its own national bank. Hamilton said that the national bank he proposed and created in 1790 would hold government debt, but acquired from the public as its capital. It would take deposit accounts from the public as well, and would lend to companies and institutions which were creating new manufacturing capacities and new economic infrastructure. This national credit institution would act to combine public capital with private capital for investment in public purposes, and not with the aim of high return on private capital. Lyndon LaRouche went beyond Hamilton in defining what kind of human invention, when realized by credit, takes society forward. It must be, he said, as it has been in America's economic history until recent decades, invention which increases the energy flux density of technologies in use, and therefore the productive power of the average person and the potential population density of the society.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Now we're going to hear from Fred Haight, who is with the Schiller Institute, joining us from Canada, on Beethoven as a Socratic revolutionary.
I have entitled this presentation, Beethoven as a Socratic Revolutionary, because over the centuries many movements have presented themselves as revolutionary that run the gamut from good to pure evil. How does one tell the difference? Well, for one thing, whenever a movement says that they wish to cancel culture, reject the past entirely, tear down all of the statues, tear down all of the heroes, and start afresh as a new generation free of prejudice, watch out. That movement can quickly become capable of committing great crimes against humanity. How could they not, if they regard that humanity has yet to get anything right? Rather than repress the past, we need to study it more, and specifically to study the great minds and souls who gave us every gift of knowledge that allowed civilization to move forward. Those souls emphatically include the great artists, and this year is the 250th birthday of one of the greatest, Ludwig van Beethoven, our subject today. However, our understanding of such great artists has suffered from an artificial division between nature, between science and art. Science supposedly based on reason without emotion, and art supposedly on emotion without reason. Add to that, a notion has been carefully fostered that a genius is someone who is absent-minded, self-absorbed, and eccentric enough to wear gloves in the summertime. Beethoven is even the subject of a book called Manic Depression and Creativity, suggesting that all creative people are a little bit nuts. Thus, Beethoven is presented as a caricature, enraged, rude, and withdrawn, even antisocial, but brilliant, a titan wrestling against the gods, in the words of Richard Wagner. That makes his very existence a mystery. We can't account for it. We don't know where he came from, why he was here, or whether we will ever see the likes of him again. Actually, we know exactly where he came from and why he was here. He was the result of a project to produce someone exactly like him. Max Franz, the Elector of Cologne, brother of Emperor Joseph II, wished to make the city of Bonn into what today we might call an Apollo-style project, a crash program, but a crash program to create a higher culture rather than land a man on the moon. He took the court theater and made it into a public theater so everyone could attend. Beethoven grew up with live performances of Schiller and Shakespeare, both of whom he loved. Beethoven's teacher, Nefa, who taught him the Preludes and Fugues of J.S. Bach, collaborated with theater director Gustav Grossmann to compose opera. Max Franz created an orchestra in which the young Beethoven played. Out of that orchestra emerged at least 4 composers, 3 good ones and 1 great one. That's what it may take to get a great one. Beethoven's piano teacher Nefa was also head of the Lesegesellschaft, or Reading Society in Bonn, where class differences were set aside and all members participated in reading great literature, both modern but also the works of the ancient Greeks and Roman. Many members of the student orchestra participated in the Reading Society, and Beethoven once commented that there was scarcely a book written too difficult for him to understand. So genius is not created by fixing on a single child, nor simply hoping for it to emerge. You foster it by educating everyone at the highest level, by uplifting all through immersion, and by creating the conditions where genius can emerge as the normal state of humanity, rather than something freakish. Beethoven was a genius, but not just as a musician, also as a thinker, philosopher, and political person. Politically, Beethoven grew up with the revolutionary idea of ending medieval feudalistic society and its hereditary class structure in favor of equality, freedom, universal education, and the establishment of forms of government that could implement such ideas. Never in his life did he abandon these ideals. He supported Napoleon when Napoleon appeared to be dedicated to liberating humanity. He even dedicated his Third Symphony, the Eroica, or Heroic Symphony, to Napoleon. But when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Beethoven scratched out the dedication, saying, now he too will trample on the rights of mankind. Beethoven would never compromise on moral and intellectual issues. That's part of what we hear in his music. He then turned his attention to another exemplar of the heroic, his only opera Fidelio. Two members of the Schiller Institute, the late Donald Fowle and my friend and colleague David Shaven, have demonstrated that the opera is almost certainly based on the imprisonment of the American Revolutionary War hero, Francis Marquis de Lafayette, and his wife Adrienne's heroic efforts to free him. Adrienne actually entered the prison to try and save her husband. When people tried to talk her out of it, she said, nothing shall dissuade me in this task. Those words are echoed in the aria of the female hero in the opera Leonora. I shall follow my inner calling, I shall not waver. I am strengthened by the duty of true married love. I know of no other work of art that portrays as heroic an image of a woman as does Fidelio, and it's not at the expense of the heroism of her husband. Both are heroes, and they sing together like two heroes. Most works of art that discuss love are about young people falling in love. Leonora sings to this true married love, the duty of true married love. Many of Beethoven's works were born out of adversity. You will hear sections of his C minor Mass today. It may sound nice, beautiful today, but it was born under extremely adverse circumstances. Beethoven knew, though, that he had to do something different to give an occupied country, his people, a gift of hope. The Mass was conditioned by Prince Nicholas Esterházy II, grandson of the prince who had sponsored Haydn. Here is a photo of the Esterházy Palace where the performance took place. You'd think to look at it, there would have been enough rooms to offer Beethoven a decent one, wouldn't you? Beethoven was quartered in a room that had not been prepared for human habitation. The prince had a custom of inviting dignitaries to his drawing room after the production of a new work to discuss it. When Beethoven entered the already ongoing discussion, the prince embarrassed him by saying, "My dear Beethoven, what is it that you have done again?" Even the chorus director broke out in laughter. Beethoven stormed out in anger, never did dedicate the work to Prince Esterházy, never even gave him a copy of it. Some historians have accused Beethoven of being oversensitive and overreacting. You judge for yourself. Esterházy let his true feelings vent in a letter to Countess Henrietta Zilimska. Quote, "Beethoven's music is unbearably ridiculous and detestable. I am not convinced it can ever be performed properly. I am angry and ashamed." Perhaps the fact that this prince is reported to have had over 200 mistresses and 100 illegitimate children might give us some clue as to his moral disagreement with Beethoven. Many composers would have responded to this attack by saying, "I better tone it down." Do you think Beethoven toned it down? No, he escalated. Now we come to the Congress of Vienna, the period late 1814, 1815 and on. Beethoven at first had high hopes for the Congress of Vienna, headed by Austrian Prince Metternich, which was assigned the task to redraw the map of Europe and bring peace to it after the Napoleonic Wars. It will soon become clear, though, that these men, known as the Conservative Order, were out to restore monarchies and empires and crush any truly Republican movements in Europe. Nothing like the U.S. Constitution would ever be seen there again if they had their way. In 1819, Metternich initiated a police state, which he personally supervised for 30 years. He did this, he used the assassination of a playwright, Kotzebue, as the pretext to implement what were known as the Carlsbad Decrees. Most historical accounts of Kotzebue call him a conservative playwright, suggesting that Metternich was acting against an attack on one of his own people. My friend and colleague René Sigerson has documented that Kotzebue was a friend of the American Revolution and a friend of Ludwig van Beethoven. His assassination seems to have served Metternich in two ways: getting rid of someone he considered a problem and beginning a police state. The Carlsbad decrees censored the press and assigned a government agent to every university with the power to fire professors and disband student unions for threatening, quote, the established order and even peace and quiet in Germany. Works by many authors were banned. Any publication under 20 pages had to pass censorship. This satirical drawing from 1819 shows a meeting of a thinkers' society. As you can see, all the thinkers have been provided with a muzzle so that they don't end up in jail afterwards for having dared open their mouths. Many people, though, responded to this police state by dumbing themselves down. It was known as the Biedermeier period in Austria. It was known as a period of lapsed classicism where people could suddenly no longer remember what they saw in Schiller and Beethoven. And the next few photos will give you a picture of this moral degeneration. First of all, family became the highest value, as today. How often do you hear family first? The rest of the world can go to heck, but I will defend my family, as though your family could exist without the world. Interior decorating became an art form. Furniture design became an art form. These are safe. They don't involve controversy, not going to get you into trouble. Poetry steered away from politics and towards nature. People dumbed themselves down in the name of peace and to stay out of trouble, as they did during the MacArthur period and the Red Scare in the United States. In such a situation, you can either degenerate or defy what is happening by developing your creative powers, the very creative powers that the police state is trying to repress, developing them for the benefit of humanity. The one thing you can't do is stand still. The people in those paintings may have thought they were standing still, but they were not. What did Beethoven do? Historians characterize it as turning inwards, writing for himself, since he was helpless to do anything, and perhaps the historians couldn't imagine themselves doing anything. That is utter nonsense. Beethoven composed his great piano sonata, Opus 111, in 1819, and began work on both the Diabelli variations and the Missa Solemnis. No one had a right to demand that he increase his creative powers to that degree, because no one knew that this level of music was even possible. Beethoven did not abandon his own time, but he was writing for the future. And he said so. He was writing for us. Why else would the Missa Solemnis celebrate 5 words? Et vitam venturi seculi, amen. The life of the world to come, amen. With a great double fugue that lasts for 6 minutes. Members of the audience who are attracted to the Schiller Institute but don't know Beethoven, I guarantee you that once you come to know him, you will love him because it's the same moral attraction. But it's not easy. The music is old, the historical stories are old, and classical music is designed to make the mind dance rather than the body dance. So I would suggest that if you are in touch with members of the Schiller Institute, you ask them to show you something about a piece by Beethoven, and I make myself available. I'm giving you my email. Anybody who emails you, I will answer him or her. You will find videos I have made at the website of the Schiller Institute New York City Chorus, and I have published over 150 short articles on Beethoven, which are posted at the website of the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture. My determination in this year of Beethoven's 250th birth, as is the determination of the Schiller Institute, is not to just bring him to the people who already know and love him, but the people who don't know him, but need him, and will love him. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Fred. Now, the final presentation before we go into questions and answers will be from Mike Billington, former political prisoner, head of the Executive Intelligence Review Asia Desk. His presentation is "Only a Global Renaissance Can Prevent War and a New Dark Age."
Thank you. Glad to be here. I want to address the cultural side of global relations, especially those between the US and China. Every great culture throughout history has gone through periods of great development, scientific and cultural, but also periods of decline and even degeneracy. In European culture, we look to Socrates and Plato, unleashing the creative powers of Europeans, and later also the creative powers of the Arab and Persian Islamic scholars during the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in the 8th century. And it was they who then reintroduced Plato and Greek thought to the Europeans, where it had largely been lost during the Middle Ages. But there was also then a total collapse of Europe in the 14th century, when the cultural and economic decay led to the Great Famine of 1315 and to the Black Death in 1346, which together killed almost half or about half of the population across Europe, reducing life expectancy from about 35 to about 17, about half across Europe. There was during that time also a state of permanent warfare called the 100 Years' War, which is what Trump has committed to ending today, the permanent warfare policy. Philosophically, it's easy to demonstrate that the periods of creative development corresponded to the hegemony of the Platonic thinking. Plato understood that the creative powers of the mind corresponded to the creative process of the universe itself, and that the mind is thus uniquely capable of discovering those laws and principles and applying those to the betterment and advancement of mankind as a whole. It's no coincidence that the oligarchs of all ages have preferred Aristotle, who believed that man was simply an animal and that the mind was nothing more than a computer database, gathering up sense perceptions and using computer logic, i.e. Aristotelian logic, to derive new theorems, but discovering nothing fundamentally new. Since real creativity requires the discovery not of just new theorems, but new principles, new axioms of thought, achieved by Platonists like Kepler and Einstein. Not accidentally, such a view of man also led Aristotle to assert that people were born either as masters or slaves, and that they could not escape their biological identity. Most convenient for oligarchs and imperialists. So let's look at China in this light. The age of Confucius and Mencius, essentially parallel to that of Plato, has served as the driving force of every age of progress in science and the arts in China. They believed that man's nature was characterized by that of Ren, which is very much like the Greek agape, a love of mankind and a love of truth. They believe man was born good because of these creative characters of the human mind. But in China, there were also schools of thought like those of Aristotle, known as the legalists and the Taoists, who were much preferred by the oligarchs, who argued that man's nature is that of an animal, and who will do as much evil as they're capable of doing in order to satisfy their sensual appetites. And thus, to be controlled, they must be controlled the way you control animals, through punishments and rewards, punishment and rewards. Under the legalists, the Confucian scholars were literally buried alive, and the Confucian texts burned, leaving some of them never recovered for posterity. The Taoists even argued that science itself was useless. It interfered with the communion between the peasant and nature, very much like today's greenies. But Confucianism generally held sway in China over the next 2,000 years. Machine tools for agriculture and the use of iron and steel in the making of those tools were very much, during the Han Dynasty, developed and used instruments and ideas that weren't developed or discovered, so-called, in Europe for 1,500 or more years. Productivity of grain production per hectare in China was multiples of anything seen in Europe until the European Renaissance. And not due to more labor, but to labor power enhanced by these advanced technologies, and making possible a population living at higher standards of living, far beyond anything in Europe, until, again, after the European Renaissance. In the Song dynasty of the 11th and 12th century, there was a Confucian Renaissance, which actually advanced Confucian thinking itself and which drove a burst of scientific and artistic progress, discovering movable type and spreading books throughout the country long before Europe. The compass, the magnetic field principles of the Earth, the gunpowder, and other great discoveries of that era. But China also had its dark ages. Most recently, that of the 19th century, when the British invaded, launched 2 opium wars, forcing opium down their throat and destroying their economy and their culture temporarily. In the 20th century, we had the Great Leap Forward and the Great Proletarian Culture Revolution in the 1950s and the 1960s. The first created a famine, which killed possibly 30 million people, and the latter, glorifying the legalists and denouncing Confucius, led to basically shattering their society and leaving millions more dead. Like the famine and chaos of the 14th century Europe, nothing less than a true Renaissance could end the carnage. No half measures would do, only a full scientific and cultural Renaissance. And that's what we must consider today. The anti-China hysteria being driven by British intelligence and their assets in American intelligence, such as Mike Pompeo, can only be refuted by getting the Americans and the Europeans to rise above the information warfare coming from our politicians and the media. Look around. There are signs of a descending dark age in the West everywhere you look, from the anarchy in the streets, the pornography and violence glorified in our so-called entertainment, the collapse of productive production in favor of speculation, and of course, the perpetual warfare. Trump is committed to combating most of these things, but half measures haven't worked and won't work. A full renaissance is required. And here is the crucial reality. China is experiencing the greatest Confucian renaissance of its history, perhaps one of the greatest renaissances in the world in history. Totally eliminating poverty, unprecedented throughout history, never achieved. Massive technological and scientific advances, and now taking those advances and the secret of infrastructure to the rest of the world through the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, an idea generated by Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. We must make this a global renaissance to end imperial geopolitics once and for all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are going to have our questions and answers, and we're going to bring various speakers of our panel up on the screen. There's quite a few. And I think Mrs. LaRouche is with us, or will be with us shortly, who may have some things to say. It's very late there. Yes. So what we have is about 45 minutes, maybe a little less, for questions and answers. We have many of you who will probably have a lot of things you want to say. So I'm going to ask Mrs. LaRouche to give us her thoughts on things and also conclude at the end of the Q&A. And then I'll call on people, but if you have something urgent that you think should be added, just raise your hand. And if we don't get through all of the questions, we're not going to worry about it. We'll have to have another conference in the future to cover all of this. But Mrs. LaRouche, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you again for a really great panel. And I don't want to make a long speech now. I rather would like people to ask the questions, and I can say something later.
Okay, excellent. So the first question is for Jacques. It is from Roberto, who says, if the historical passage from industrial to post-industrial society was created by the same ideology as the self-made man, and if the new frontier of this evil revolution is now the cyber society, that is the idea of substituting robots for human beings. And I think there's many aspects of that. And at the same time, maybe he's asking if there would be a correlation and I would say this is particularly this is me speaking, in the West, that there is a large number of people who are older. I think that is not the case in many other parts of the world where we have the tremendous resource of young people. But Jacques, if you have some thoughts on our new cyber society.
Yes, the plan they have is based on the Malthusian reduction of population. So we have the extremists who want to very fast go to 1.5 or 2 billion human beings or even less, and the others who want to have a more mastered reduction that they think could be achieved. So the ones who want to have a process of controlled reduction, they say we are going to introduce all the technological means, which, by the way, come from the discovery of new physical principles, but they apply this as technologies to control the populations. So this is artificial intelligence, this is all the digital society, and the introduction of 3D robots, etc. So they launch that as an operation where they would replace labor by this type of introduction of machines, and mainly with not new physical principles, but mere technological applications in the world of communications. So they have various reports. There is an Oxford report, there is another report in France, there are reports in the United States saying that the population, the workforce, would reduce between 15 and 50%. So what we do with the rest? So they say, Yuval Noah Harari wrote a book called Homo Deus, in which he says that the plan is to immerse these people into a world of artificial functioning, which means video games, screens, etc. And people immersed in that would be given just enough to survive, and they would be induced not to reproduce themselves. So that's the plan. You have the extremist plan, which is immediate destruction with a war, which you see, you have seen in your conference, for example, what Richard Black brought, or others. And then you have the other way to reduce the population. So this doesn't mean that digital developments, artificial intelligence, and so on, are bad in themselves. They are good if they are connected with industrial development and what Hamilton's always say, that Paul Gallagher referred to, which is the human capacity to create and transform the universe. So in that sense, if they are connected to industries, they are connected to transformation of matter, if they are developed and they are connected to development of energy, more intense energy flux, which is fusion, and they are connected to the space exploration, then they become useful, because you want to communicate with Mars. You have a time span between, let's say, 12 and 25 minutes, according to the position of Mars relative to the Earth. So you have to have something in the robot in Mars, in the rover, which manages by itself, in given conditions, to take certain form of decisions, knowing where he goes. So this has nothing to do with human creativity. It has to do with a useful utilization in industrial processes and in exploration processes of things that you can master in a given sense of things. The very difference between what Krafft Erike called the extraterrestrial imperative is that there man is going to meet things that he doesn't know about. It's about coronavirus. We don't know exactly what it is. So then the exploration quality of man becomes absolutely necessary. And there is no way that all these things, the digital economy, the artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, could afford who permit to reach new principles of new discoveries. That's strictly what man can do, inspired by artistic compositions and experience it in the form of science. And this is what always Einstein repeated, what always LaRouche repeated in a more advanced way. And this is our challenge, is to be ourselves beyond these applied technologies that are promoted, being capable of creating new physical principles, new artistic compositions, and make a society work on this basis. And what I tried to bring today with the Indian approach, Tagore at the best, the Chinese approach, Confucius and Mencius, and our approach, the Greek development, the Mosaic, and then the Christian developments, is what can be as a whole, has to be in the minds, replied experiences, rediscoveries, and then promote discoveries from there on in our own minds to create a society of the future to the advantage of the other. Because the last thing I want to say about Lin is that what he always created, the spark of creation he created in us, was not for the mere interest of creating. It was always connected to an improvement and a going further of society. And this is what is immortal in us, this participation to the universe and its creation, and to master it, to go into better and better forms of human development.
Great, thank you. Now, this is the question from Germany to Nicole Frank, and perhaps Mike Calicrate might also want to. The person writes, Ms. Frank said that U.S. meat is the safest in the world, but I've heard that one of the reasons why the populations of Europe doesn't want to get TTIP was because they didn't want to get chlorine chickens, which meant they feared that the U.S. has lower standards. Could you please tell us more about the standards of U.S. meat production?
Could you repeat the question one more time, please? I had to unmute, so I wasn't able to hear all the questions.
Sure. He's saying that Europeans are afraid of what they call chlorine chickens. They fear that the U.S. has low standards on meat production. So this is from someone in Germany. He's asking for you to say more about the safest meat in the world here in the U.S.
Well, what I've been seeing with the Packers, they're making you guys think that because they want to buy the cheap stuff. And because at K-State, I learned that in other countries, they get U.S. inspected, but it's not every day. Like in the United States, we're inspected constantly for food contaminations. And that's when we get hit with, since we have JBS, which is owned by Brazil, and so is National. There was a couple times that we had meat coming from Brazil, and that was when the inspection came in, and the meat was contaminated. And it was all said that as farmers contaminated it, because no one knows that we were importing from 20 different countries.
Great. Mike, Mike Calicrate, do you want to add to that? Oh,
I know I can answer it.
I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. Did you have more?
Oh, I was just asking for Michael. He's more knowledgeable than I am.
Thanks, Nicole. To the extent that the United States has the most industrialized food system in the world would not lend much credibility to it being. It's a very highly integrated industry and structure to our food production and distribution. That when there is a problem, it's a really, really big problem because it's distributed nationally and globally. The fact is, USDA honestly doesn't work for the people. The USDA is a captured agency that works for the big meat packing and big food companies across the world. And so we're all taught in college and ongoing by organizations like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the safest food in the world. But it could be easily argued that may not be the case. And when we look at the alternative food system development, safe food has to be a priority. It has to be a major objective. But the fact is, we probably have never had more food calls than we have today, from the processed food sector to the raw food sector from vegetables, and fruits, and meat. And so you probably can't say and claim in truth that we have the safest food supply in the world. We know one thing: we've got the most fragile food system in the world. After COVID, you know what happened in grocery stores across the country. The shelves went bare. That is not a dependable food system, and to that extent, it's not a safe food system.
Oh, Jacques wants to say something?
Yeah, one word. I think the solution of that is what Mike calculated, Mike, what you brought, is the need to support the consumer and the pathways to the consumer. And then the problem is practically solved because you have a common purpose of the producer and the consumer to have the best product.
You've got responsibility built right in. That's right.
Head. Ron?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think part of the process of thinking that we have a problem with our food production or our processing in this country is in the past 10 days, one of the larger chicken processors in California was closed down because I can't remember, it was 4 or 6 people died because of the coronavirus, and over 500 people were infected. I mean, that's a terrible example, and that's brought about by we've got all kinds of rules and regulations on these processors, but are they being enacted? I mean, are the inspectors being bought off, or what is going on? I think we do have a problem, and I think that needs to be looked into.
Good. Well, maybe I'll ask this related question, and see who would like to address it. What are your thoughts on the current U.S. and Western method of price setting for food, that is, leaving it to the whims of the market? What would you propose to replace the current system of speculation? Bob
We don't have
Baker.
a market.
Well, yeah.
Can you
We
hear me?
don't. Yeah, I heard you. We don't have a market. There's a huge market, but there's a gigantic blob sitting between the farmers and the market.
There is no market. It is a price that is set by the middlemen, by the big retailers in partnership with big meat packers and food companies. When you think about a market, you think about competitiveness. You think about choices. You think about lots of buyers and lots of sellers. And as Bob talked about in his presentation, the beef industry is controlled by 4 multinational corporations. They control 85% of it. And for me, it's been really concentrated. We know that they've been cooperating. They don't compete. It's simply a, and proof of that is the producer's share of the consumer dollar. Right now, on the National Union numbers, come out with a farmer food share calculation periodically, but we're down to about 15 cents. The farmer gets about 15 cents of the consumer food dollar, and our share of the consumer beef dollar has never been lower. And this is at the same time as the big meat packers, in justifying their consolidation, their merger, their buyouts, have talked about improvements in efficiencies as being one of the reasons, or economies of scale being one of the reasons. And we talked earlier about the big lie, Marcia. You talked about the big lies. That's one of the really big lies, is that this industrialized, concentrated system is more efficient and has economies of scale. That is simply true. And going back to a local regional food system development would bring all kinds of new efficiencies and economies of scale, as well as a whole lot of improvement in the environment and addressing poverty and hunger and reduction in food. So honestly, the industrial food system hasn't got one single attribute, not one single attribute, except for increased income for the people that are in the executive suites. If you think that's
I might mention,
Bob Baker, is that you?
yeah, I might mention two things. One is, Mike, I think you got a loose connection on your microphone, but also the situation with the monopolies. I mean, this is not by accident. This is the oligarchy's method of completely taking over the food supply, controlling food in order to control the population. And also to, just like the discussions we've heard about the culture, about the music, about the whole destruction of what it takes to maintain a human culture to a higher and higher level. So when you look at the food system and you look at the little bitty handful of people that are, or corporations that control such a large amount of the most important aspect of human society, one of them be food. You can't live without it. Most people buy into the line, well, this is, more efficient. And they say, well, the consumer demands this. These are the narratives created by monopolies because they don't think about the alternative, where what if we had 1 million new farmers in the United States, 1 million new farmers in Europe, 1 million new farmers in Africa, in South America, then all using the highest states of technology in the most productive way. Then what you have is you've just upgraded the skill level of food producers all throughout the world. And in that process, you're going to change the communities and the cities. And you're also going to change the relationship between the city consumers and the producers of food and everything else in terms of manufacturing, industry, and those types of things. So it's a whole dynamic that's involved. But the monopolization, all this is the oligarchy's way of creating an instrument through which they can funnel trillions of dollars and then just rake off the money while they put the producers and the citizens rip them off. But the process lowers the skill level of and the number of people that are skilled in society.
I think Mrs. LaRouche has something she'd like to say. Sorry, Ron, I see you there, but go ahead, Helga.
Well, I think there is a method behind that which is not just profit. I mean, profit of the cartels and so forth is one thing. But if you remember what Ms. Nsono from Congo just said earlier, that the developing countries are confronted with cheap imports, which are much cheaper than what they can produce locally, which tends to completely ruin their agriculture. So there is a method behind it, which is also expressed, for example, by the EU guidelines. I mean, everybody knows the German farmers and the European farmers all go bankrupt because they have prices which are over years and years getting lower and lower, and they're not maintaining even the maintenance of the farm, leave alone any investment or any profit. So many of them go bankrupt, and now the EU has made new guidelines, which I think force the farmers to put 25% of the land aside for weeds to grow. And since the weeds cannot take humus, fertile soil, because the weeds like more poor soil, they have to basically destroy the good soil in order for the weeds to grow, so that the biodiversity and the insects and so forth, they all have a good life. Now, it is obvious that this is a complete destruction of the food production, and it's in line with the exit from the energy. It's the Green Deal, which the EU is now enforcing very rapidly. The big banks, for example, are only giving credits to green investments. For example, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank, they have written letters to their customers that they only can get credit if they invest in green things. Now, green things means low energy density energies, which has a lower population density. So behind all of that is really also the oligarchical idea to reduce the population. And I think we should not overlook that, because I'm absolutely convinced that people like Prince Philip, the World Wildlife Fund, and similar organizations, they couldn't care less if people are dying of starvation, because they say this is just, what Bertrand Russell said. These are methods which are a little bit ugly, but so be it. We just have to have a pandemic every generation so that the others can freely procreate. I mean, these disgusting thoughts, I think they are quite real, and they should get people really enraged.
Ron, with Zorik, did you have something? Ron, you're muted.
Some figures from Harwood Schaefer and Darrell Ray, who are two ag professors from the Tennessee University. And what I wanted to bring up in support of what Bob was saying and what Helga was saying about low prices is the 1976 to 1978 period, the U.S. export share of global corn market plummeted from 81.6% to 35.3% in 2016 through 2018. Now, this is a result of a 55-year Department of Agriculture programs. The false premise that if we have cheap prices, we will gain exports, and that will be the salvation of the American farmer. I mean, I remember basically the period from 1942 to 1952 when we were looking at 90 to 115% of parity, and prices were corn was almost as high as it is today in actual dollar figures, and we were feeding a big share of the world. After World War II, we basically saved the world from starvation. I don't remember a lack of food in our stores here in America during that late 40, 50 period to what we saw here in the last year or so. So I mean, the Department of Agriculture, with only basically we have less than 800,000 farmers that are producing most of the agriculture products in America. They don't have much of a voice in Washington D.C. anymore. So without educating, as Mike was saying, educating the eaters, we're not going to get the policies enforced that we need. I guess that's the point I wanted to get across, is that
Mike Billington said, but Marcia also had her hand up before. Marcia, did you have something you wanted to say? Make sure you're unmuted. Oh, Marcia, we can't hear Marcia. We can't hear you. So I'll go to Mike Billington. Mike, while you're there I have a question for you as well, but why don't you say what you want to say on this, and then I'll ask you the question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
This gets to the question of why the American people tolerate this kind of destruction of agriculture and industry, and as Bob Bowen mentioned, our culture. And it really gets to the British Empire issue, what it really means. We had under Roosevelt the idea of freedom, the four freedoms that we discussed earlier in the event, including freedom from want, we had under Kennedy the idea that ask not what your country can do from you, but what you can do from your country. This idea of freedom is what can you contribute to humanity. Now, freedom is you don't dare challenge free market, free enterprise. You don't dare say we should not have these four cartels because, oh, well, that's interfering in their freedom, the freedom of the marketplace. This is pure British. And when Kennedy was killed, the British moved in. They moved in with the idea that freedom, the Milton Friedman, the freedom of the banks to do what they want to do away with the Roosevelt controls, the freedom of the right to have prostitution and drugs. This is freedom. There's a very, very good joke by our friends in New York, by the way, who said, when somebody tells you, oh, how can you possibly support China? Don't you understand they're a vicious authoritarian dictatorship, that the people have no freedom in that country? And the answer is, yes, I know, it's a dictatorship. Why, you know, their children have to do their homework. And not only that, but they're not allowed to smoke marijuana. And there's no pornography on the internet. Can you imagine living without pornography? I mean, 40% of the internet in America is pornography, which is prostitution. So you're dealing here with a concept of freedom, which is so perverted. It's the best way to understand the British Empire's role in the world is that, not so much that it's someone over there in London per se. The city of London and the monarchy are behind this, but it's the destruction of the concept of creativity and the idea of freedom being perverted into this kind of idea that, in fact, you can do anything you want. If you think about the freedom defined by the ability to develop the creative powers of your mind, to participate in beauty, to be part of the creativity that advances to 50 years from now, to 100 years from now. I mean, that is what liberates the mind from the animal instincts, from the animal idea that we're simply beasts who want to satisfy our sensual gratifications, to one in which we are actually those creative beings in the image of God who can create the future. And it's there that you have to inspire our people to come to reject this kind of dictatorship that we've heard today in the agriculture sector, in the health sector, and so forth. It's that idea that we have to restore.
Mike, you already sort of answered the question, because it's about the news media and that they lie about everything, which we've heard in this conference. They lied about Lyndon LaRouche, they lie about President Trump, they lie about the farmers, they lie about China, and so on. There may be more on that. I want to go to Marcia, because I think we can hear her. And then I have something for Paul, and then we'll open it up again. Go ahead, Marcia.
Thank you. You can see that I switched to the cornfield here. And in response to both the question and some comments from Helga, Nicole, Mike, I just wanted to throw in the specifics Helga mentioned about the representative this morning from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She said that imported chickens there are $2, whereas locally grown chickens are $6. And but for the continent of Africa as a whole, they have to import into the continent 40% of their daily food. This is staples. This isn't specialty food. This is 40%. This is wheat, rice, sorghum, this kind of thing. And that is absolutely the other side of the coin from what Nicole reported and Mike and other people here. And let me just give let me just throw in one quick update. I just found out a couple hours ago that on Friday, the humanitarian director for the United Nations, a man named Mark Lowcock, gave a letter to the UN Security Council about 4 nations in famine. It's not been made public. Wouldn't you know, the New York Times managed to get it and aren't making it public in detail. But they refer to, I think, northeastern Nigeria, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Yemen. And so this thing, I can only repeat, it's really moving along. I'll say in passing, we had a glitch, and I had a world map that's current of hunger hotspots in the world. We'll put that up when this panel is posted. It didn't get shown, but you can picture what I'm talking about. And that brings me around to the final thing. When you talk about narratives that keep us under control, besides the fact we don't get any information, do we? I mean, we're frauds and lies. But Nicole mentioned that if you're a cattleman, that's portrayed as bad in many ways, or if you're this or if you're that. If you're, to many people, U.S. farmers are said to get subsidies so bad, which isn't true. They're being ruined. And as Nicole said, you have a suicide rate. But do you know the situation is so severe in the U.S. right now that fully half of the aggregate income of all the farmers together in the U.S. is probably going to be emergency funds from the Trump administration, which is a nice thing to save farmers, but the system is blown out. We should have parity pricing. We should have antitrust. They're on the books. And we should be mustering the volumes of emergency food needed for these places in the world I just mentioned. And also if we have antitrust, parity pricing, bust up the monopolies, you can order that. We have precedent for that big time. Then we wouldn't have this situation. But the final thing I just wanted to throw in is that on the question of labeling and narratives, we have some, on the action side of things, we have some things that are taking place. Like a friend told me that in a few weeks, when the harvest period in September is over, the German farmers may be back on the streets demonstrating with their tractors again. In the US, we have press conferences by farmers every other couple weeks. For example, we had one some weeks ago, where especially the hog farmers in Minnesota said to the federal government, please help us provide the money for all the hogs that we have to destroy. We have to euthanize. That's a polite word. We have to kill them and go into a animal compost heap. But the thing that we get, where we get into trouble is you're definitely always told, even by so-called friends, stick to your single issue. And here are terrific initiatives by the farmers in the streets in Germany, and the US cattle and other farmers are activating. People are doing things. So if we put the biggest picture in, as Helga talked about, that is the coincidence about, the coinciding common interests between groups that usually are supposed to oppose each other, I think it's the only way to proceed. I'm not giving a recipe for what the German farmers are saying, because they'll be there against these awful green rules and the low prices. And the US farmers are active too. But I just wanted to throw that in there on everything.
Great, thanks. I'll ask this to Paul, and then I think we're going to let Helga pull this all together for us. Someone writes in, and you may have other things, Paul, on the question of food and so on, but what does the U.S. Federal Reserve as a private company contribute to the financial power of the British Empire? What would happen if we turned it into a national bank? Would we then be able to defeat the British Empire?
Well, maybe the full answers to those things would take a while, but basically, what does it contribute to the British Empire? At this point, virtually everything. The City of London banks, as well as the Wall Street banks, are being injected with huge volumes of liquidity by our Federal Reserve. It's directly and through swap lines with the Bank of England. And the Federal Reserve is providing the background for the moves that the Bank of England is trying to lead under this fellow Andrew Bailey, who took over from Mark Carney, in order to introduce what they call central bank digital currencies. And that takes a little time, but there you're going to have, if the central banks get in their digital currencies and manage to take direct control of economies with those digital currencies, we will have an absolute green holocaust. So in terms of nationalizing it, I mean, I'd like to, we should, yes, but I'd like to react or respond to what's been discussed here as a whole. To say that there is a market for food, national market or international market for food, which one should be for or against that market, is like saying that there is a market for credit in the United States. There is no market for credit. There are 11 huge banks, and they are withdrawing credit, as Helga mentioned a little while ago. They're in the process of pulling credit out of that credit market, not putting it in. The Fed puts liquidity into them. They pull credit out of the market in order to speculate. So the individual farm household is not facing a credit market. Instead, it's duking it out with probably one local bank, which has a lot of bad loans and a high cost of acquiring capital right now, and therefore is not offering them much of anything in the way of credit. And the same thing applies to whether there is a market for food. Again, the American system, which I discussed in my presentation earlier, later in the 19th century, a great deal was written by American system economists about wages, prices, tariffs, and in particular, Henry Carey, Lincoln's friend and sometime advisor, put down as a principle that the closer producers were brought to their suppliers and those who are going to buy their products, the higher incomes for everyone would be. That if you have a diversity, a local diversity of both industry and agriculture, and the interchange of products among them is primarily not small, but in a local and regional area, the prices, wages, incomes of everybody are going to be higher as a result of that. And that we have to bring that about. The kind of operation that Mr. Calcrate described earlier, his own operation, obviously we have to make that it possible that that kind of thing spread across the United States and also in Europe. And this is where a real national credit institution comes in, a nationalized Federal Reserve, a Reconstruction Finance Corporation on the model of Roosevelt's. That kind of a credit institution can make it possible for the kind of advances that were described with this Friesla company, these local meat lockers and the way they integrate them into the power and water and related supplies. That can make it possible through credit for that kind of thing to proliferate wherever food is being grown, so that and other agricultural products are being grown, so that everybody involved has an access to that kind of credit and also has an access to a production and distribution system which they can see and which works and which raises incomes generally. So it's whether we nationalize the Federal Reserve or not, the point is, what is the mission? What are you going to try to do with the credit that a national credit institution is going to create? Once that's clear, then there are a lot of ways to do it.
Great, thank you. All right, I said to Helga, since it is the Beethoven year, Fred, if you have something that you would like to say very briefly, and then we're going to Helga.
Yeah, I just want to mention we began a project at the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture. We call it Daily Doses of Beethoven. And I've been writing an article every day there for about 5 months. We're getting a very good response on it, a lot of forwarding, a lot of questions. But as I said at the end of it, my intention really is not to just appeal to the people who already know and love Beethoven, but we have to make him available to everybody because he is our ally. I don't know what else, whether you had a question about that or not, but that's what I'd say.
Great. Well, thank you. So now, Helga, What would you like to
Is that my
say?
last word here?
What?
Is this my last word I'm asking?
I hope not, but it's your last word of this conference.
Oh, okay. No, I wasn't sure. First of all, I think that we should go out with several initiatives out of this conference. One, I think what Mike Callicrate is presenting as a model is, I think, really attractive. And in the period now after the COVID-19, there is in general a very far-reaching discussion that you have to get shorter production chains, that the production has to be closer to the consumption just to avoid such disruptions as we have seen it with medical supplies and other things. So I think it's a ripe moment to really launch this model. And frankly, when you saw these calves and cows of Nicole, I mean, they looked like pretty happy cows, And I think this is also coming very important, that I mean, I like animals, and I don't want to get sentimental now. I never want to meet an animal I'm going to eat because, in any case, I think the question of treating animals well is also part of a human society. And, if you look at these endless industrial, transports from, you produce the animal in one country, then you ship it somewhere else to be slaughtered, then you ship it back to be processed. I mean, this is just absolutely insane, and it's bad for the meat. The animals have stress before they are slaughtered. It has a bad impact on the quality of the meat. So I think the model which Mike has presented is really something we should really promote in a big way. And I think a lot of people, for one reason or another, will agree with it. So we should really update the call to increase the food production, which Marcia and Bob were writing a couple of months ago. And given the fact that you have now the World Food Program, I mean, they issued this request many months ago that they need a ridiculous 5 billion, and they got only 750 million. And if they don't get these 4 billion, which is still peanuts as compared to the bailouts and all these other programs, then you will have mass starvation. And we should really, escalate our campaign with the program which Marcia and Bob were writing a couple of months ago. So that's one thing. In general, I think this conference was really incredible, because if you think the totality of the picture, in the first panel, we were talking about the immediate danger of nuclear war. And unfortunately, as we were talking, there were more incidents of the surveillance intercepts. This is really very dangerous. So we should rebel rouse the population internationally to this danger. Then naturally what Senator Richard Black was saying is also unbelievable. I mean, this danger of a military coup, or even the discussion of that. Then, what Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe were saying about, the incredible surveillance state, this court ruling, which basically declared the NSA spying as illegal, and quoting Snowden. I think this is also extremely explosive, because this just adds to the ammunition. So we should get that out. I think all of this. Then we had this beautiful science panel, which I think gave a hopeful perspective that with space travel and research, but also with if an increased funding in the fusion program would take place, maybe we could have it earlier than 15 years or 10 years. But in any case, the idea to go in this direction is an incredible impetus. And then we had the whole perspective of the World Land Bridge as the way how to create the jobs necessary. So I think we have an incredible package coming out of this conference. And I think we should really make videos, shorter videos, about aspects of that really get a total mobilization to target groups who would be interested in it. Like, for example, a lot of people were internationally completely upset about what Snowden had to say 7 years ago. And, I think that this is now coming from a US court, that this was regarded illegal. And President Trump had mooted the possibility of pardoning Snowden. So something is in the air. And that should all, escalate our campaign, obviously on the whole coup question, but also the absolute, in my view, there are two flanks which can change the situation in time. One is to get the Binney story and the whole coup question out, what we published since, the beginning actually. But the second thing being really to have this summit. And I think this idea to have the P5 summit or even the P3 summit, the three largest nuclear powers of the world, the United States, Russia, China. I think if we mobilize the whole world as a chorus of people who demand that these strongest, most powerful governments in the world take charge now. And what Mr. Kortunov said, that the P5 is worried that, the other countries don't want them to take too much decisions for them. I don't think that that is something to worry. I think right now we have a complete lack of leadership. I mean, people in general have lost the trust in governments, in institutions. People are looking at, the EU, for example, and there's coming absolutely nothing in their interest, but only things against their interest. So if there is any combination of people who, like the 3 presidents or the 5 presidents, and they would say, this is an unprecedented crisis. We never, probably in all of history, never had something like that. So we propose a program which does take care of the needs of all people on this planet. And we will implement that, and we will have a new Bretton Woods system because we need credit for development. I don't think anybody, maybe the City of London, maybe some other tiny places, would oppose it. But I can assure anybody who is worried about that the world is crying for leadership. And, I can only hope that our mobilization coming out of this conference will inspire enough people so that, we are asserting the pressure to have a new world economic order, to have a world health system, to stop the famine. I mean, what are we waiting for? I mean, this is an unprecedented crisis. And if we, use the proceedings of this conference to escalate, on all of these points, maybe we can create an environment where these leaders of the most powerful countries feel the inspiration that they will be judged by history, and they have to make sure that there is a history, because if there's World War III, that is really ended. So I think we should go out of this conference being inspired, being provoked, being challenged, but get active like never before.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So as it says in the program, we're now going to hear the 2018 performance of the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus of Beethoven's Mass in C. And I have a special request for everybody listening, because when you hear great music, and let me just say it's conducted by John Segerson, and the soloists are Indira Mahajan, soprano, Linda Childs, alto, Everett Settle, tenor, and Kostas Tsarakis, bass. I wanted to tell you all that I will not be offended if you hit the pause button right now and take a break, eat, go for a walk, whatever you need to do, because when you listen to Beethoven or any great composer, you really want to allow yourself to hear the full intention and to hear the arc of the work from the beginning to the end. This performance is about 53 minutes long, so I would encourage you to prepare yourself to listen for that amount of time and to listen to particularly how Beethoven concludes this Mass with the words, Dona nobis pacem, give us peace. So thank you very much for participating, and we will now go to the Mass.